Welcome to If Oxford, the Science and Ideas Festival. It's lovely to have you all here today. Tonight's event is why losing a few pounds may be good for you, and we will be presented by Professor Susan Jebb. But before we introduce Susan, I would like to introduce Gavin Hubbard from the National Institute for Health Research.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Thanks to Kathy, Dane and the IF Festival for organising this series of events. I'd like to welcome you all to this talk on behalf of the National Health Institute of Health Research. This is part of a series of talks that we're running with the IF Festival called Health Research and You. As well as today's talk with Susan, we've got Why Your Body Clock is Important for Health on the 12th of October. Childhood Anxiety, Helping Parents Help Their Children on the 19th of October. How to Imitate a Pancreas on the 26th of October, and Pelvic Pain, Diagnosing Endometriosis Sooner on the 28th of October. For those of you who don't know what the NHR is, I will just briefly tell you that it is in fact the nation's largest funder of health and care research, and was established in 2006 to improve the health and wealth of the nation through research, and it's funded by the Department of Health and Social Care. That means we get to fund wonderful researchers and their teams, just like Susan Jebb. And Susan is Professor of Diet and Population Health at the University of Oxford's Nuffield Department of Primary Care Health Sciences. Her research team develop and test how to support people to eat more healthily, lose weight, and generally improve their health. She works with the government to encourage and develop effective policy and new ways of working in the NHS that are based on a good scientific grounding. And Susan may look familiar to some of you from her appearances on TV programmes such as BBC Horizon's What's the Right Diet for You back in 2015, or more recently the Big Crash Diet Experiment, which was in 2018, I believe. She's also frequently made media appearances on TV and radio news to comment on or clarify various diet and health-related stories over the years. So over to Susan.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and it's great to be with you all this evening. I'm very sorry it's not in person, but nonetheless, thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to share my screen now, and then we can start the presentation. So obesity is one of those issues that I've been working on for 25 years, long before most of the rest of the world had worked out that actually perhaps this was a problem. But as you can see in this slide here, the number of people who are living with obesity has gone up year on year. This graph just goes back to 1993. But in fact, when I started working in this area back in the mid-80s, the number of people who were very overweight was only 7% of the population. And today, more than a quarter of adults are living with obesity. That's been a pretty relentless rise. Now, what that tells me, at least, is that this isn't something about individuals who are somehow lost the plot. This tells us that the world around us has changed. It's become increasingly hard for people to manage their weight. And so in my research team, what we're interested in is really two different lines of attack. One is to really change the environment that we live in, to make it easier for people to have a healthy diet. And the second is to help those people who are already affected by obesity to actually be able to manage their weight using real evidence-based strategies. And I want to tell you a little bit about both of those pieces of work today, and in particular, how they fit with the new announcements that we've heard from the government about their plans to tackle obesity. Now, why are we interested in this in the National Institute for Health Research? It's because obesity harms health. Excess weight's a risk factor for a whole range of different diseases. If you think about it, carrying excess weight is putting an added strain on pretty well every system in our body. And you can see in this simple infographic here, just some of the conditions which are more likely to occur for people who are overweight. The one I'm going to talk most about today is type 2 diabetes, but it's also important to recognise it has many other, obesity has many other effects, including at least 12 different kinds of cancer. Now, of course, the new thing that we've started talking about in the context of obesity is coronavirus. It's taking its toll on the UK in so many different ways. But one of the things that research has revealed is that being overweight is a significant risk factor for having more serious COVID complications. So your weight doesn't affect whether you're going to catch COVID or not. It doesn't discriminate in that way. But if you're unfortunate enough to have COVID, and if you're also overweight, the chances that you will need to go into hospital, or that you might even have to go into intensive care, or worst of all, the chances that you might actually die as a result of the infection are much higher for people who are overweight. And you can see that in this slide here, which is some work that our team have been doing very recently, looking at information from nearly 7 million people, where we are able to anonymously access their electronic health records. So we don't know who these people are, but we do know what their weight and height is, and we know whether they've been tested for COVID and whether they've been admitted to hospital. And what you see as your body mass index increases, and just to remind you, we say that 20 to 25 is the healthy range. 25 to 30 is what we tend to call overweight. And you can see the risk increases a little bit for people who are overweight. But beyond a BMI of 30, this is the point at which people are classified as having obesity. And you can see that the risks of COVID complications, if you like, go up very, very sharply. And so, whilst fortunately most people don't have COVID, which is the reason why the government in particular has started to pay much more attention to obesity. Once you recognise it's a risk factor for COVID, you also start to think that how much of a risk factor it is for many, many other diseases too. Now, the other thing that has been interesting during the COVID pandemic, and particularly during the lockdown period, is that people who weren't already trying to manage their weight suddenly found that it became a whole lot more difficult. Once people were out of their usual routines, their diet changed, their physical activity changed, and many, many people reported that they were gaining weight. This is some data which perhaps helps to explain that. So this is looking at food purchasing data. So the volume of food and drink which people have bought, going back to the beginning of the year in January. And you can see it's pottering along here. And then there's this sharp rise in that period before lockdown, when people started worrying there'd be food shortages. It sinks down a little bit afterwards when everybody would eat up the things they'd stockpiled in their cupboards. But look what's happened in this period subsequently. You can see that the average level of food purchases is quite a bit higher than it was before the pandemic really hit. And of course, that extra food and drink purchased is very likely to be consumed. Not many of us buy food and leave it in the cupboards for several months. Once it's been bought, we tend to eat it. And that increased food is increasing calories and is increasing the chances of us gaining weight. The problem's compounded by the types of food that we're buying more of. So this slide looks in a little bit more detail. You can see that overall, apart from oral care products, so for some reason we're buying fewer toothbrushes, but other than that, all of these products that we buy in the supermarket are actually being increased. And there have been particularly marked rises in the amount of alcohol. That's partly because people are eating out and drinking in pubs and things less than previously. So more of that's happening at home. So alcohol's gone up by nearly 30%. But you can also see big increases in things like crisps and other snacks, and in things like confectionery, which is here. So confectionery has increased by 20%. So more and more people are thinking that they're going to have to take specific action to manage their weight. I think many people that I talk to tell me that this really is time for a rethink, not just about what they're eating and drinking, but it's been a bit of a moment in life where everybody is rethinking the way we work, rethinking the people we socialize with, and what we eat and drink is right in the spotlight. It's not just for you and me, it's also the Prime Minister who's been thinking a bit more about this. Of course, he was unfortunate enough to to contract coronavirus and to be admitted to hospital and indeed to intensive care. And part of that is about age. We know that the biggest risk factor for serious complications is age. Being a man increases your risk slightly, but also being overweight is one of those factors which is likely to have contributed to the greater severity of his infection. And having come out of hospital, what this has done is to really focus his mind on how we can perhaps tackle obesity in a way which is going to improve the health of the nation. As a consequence of that, we saw very rapidly a new obesity plan launched by the government. Over the years, there's been a whole series of these. You can see them piling up on this slide and in my office. And this is the latest one, which is still so new, and the government's obviously been so busy, they haven't actually managed to turn it into a nice format yet. But this was the latest strategy, which came out just at the end of July. And there are two important elements to this, which very much reflect the kind of research agenda that we've been pursuing in Oxford. The first is to recognise that people need more help to manage their food intake, and particularly at this time following COVID. And so there are some really important interventions which are about trying to change what we call the food environment. So the general look and feel and atmosphere around food. So particularly things like the marketing and promotion of foods. And so in the plan, we see new proposals to actually restrict the advertising of unhealthy food on television and also online. And also to take action in supermarkets so that it reduces the likelihood of us purchasing these less healthy products. We know, for example, that if you have products which are sold on the end of an aisle in the supermarket, people are much more likely to purchase them. One of our projects showed a 50% increase in sales of sugary drinks when they were on the end of an aisle. That's because it's a very prominent location. And so these new proposals will restrict what can be placed in those positions in supermarkets. It doesn't prevent anybody's choice. You can still buy whatever it is you choose to buy in the supermarkets. But what this legislation is trying to do is to reset that environment such that we're not actively encouraging people to make the less healthy choices. And there were also plans for improved nutritional labelling, which is going to be mandated in out-of-home places, so coffee shops and cafes, and also to introduce new nutritional labelling on packaged foods. And all of these things are designed just to make us a little bit more aware of how the food we consume might actually increase our risk of gaining weight. Now, preventing excess weight gain is really, really important. None of us choose to be overweight, and so helping people to avoid that in the first place is absolutely crucial. But as I showed you in that first slide, we live in a country in which over a quarter of the population are already living with obesity. And in fact, if you look at this graph, which shows where we are now, this figure, what you can see is that only about, well, 31% of men and, a little bit more than that for women actually have a healthy weight. So more than 2/3 of adults are overweight. And so we need to recognise that if we're serious about tackling obesity, we also need to offer people more help in order to actually lose a little bit of weight. Now, there's often great pessimism about losing weight. Many people think, oh, that it's too hard. What I hope to do is to show you some evidence from some of the trials we've been conducting, which show that actually, if you're part of a formal weight loss programme, in fact, losing weight is very achievable. and also brings very significant health benefits. Perhaps some of the good news in a way is that many people are already trying to lose weight, and over time the proportion of people trying to lose weight has increased. So you can see that in this latest data from 2013, about 40% of men and just over half of women at any one time were trying to lose weight. The problem is that most people try to do that on their own. There are, of course, no shortage of advice and books and videos and internet sites telling you how you can lose weight. And many people are confused. Many people jump from one to the other. And the evidence that we've collected and analysed here suggests that although when people try to take part in these sort of self-help interventions, they do work, people do lose some weight, but actually the weight loss is rather modest. So if we look at from a range of these different studies, which you see on this slide, after 6 months, people on average had lost just under 4 pounds, 1.88 kilograms. So that's good, but perhaps not as much as we would hope for all that effort that people are putting in. So we've been interested in how we can help people to self-manage their weight more effectively. We've been doing a little bit of work on digital support or remote support using apps, for example, to help people lose weight. And this is not our work, but this is the app that the government has just launched as part of its plan, which you can download from the App Store, and is essentially an NHS approved weight management programme. Some of you might be familiar with the Couch to 5K app, which the NHS has, which has been really successful in helping people to become more physically active. And what this app is designed to do is to help people who want to lose weight to have an evidence-based, healthy support to be able to do that. But what we know from all of our research is that having some in-person, some tangible support which understands your needs as an individual is incredibly important and can make all the difference for a successful weight loss attempt. We're based in the Department of Primary Care, and so we've been particularly interested in what GPs and the primary healthcare system might do to enable this to happen. And we've been studying how effective it might be if doctors were to refer people to weight loss programs in the community. Just going to show you data from one of our studies, and this was a trial in which doctors offered people the opportunity to attend a community weight loss group. So you might have come across things like Weight Watchers or Slimming World, but there are a number of these types of programs where people are able to attend each week. They receive advice and guidance from a leader, but also support from other people in the group. Here you have the results of our trial. Now, in a trial, what we do is recruit a large group of people who are interested and keen for support to lose weight. And then we randomly allocate them into one, in this case, of 3 groups. The first group, shown in blue, just got some general advice to help them lose weight, a booklet. So this was really self-management. The other 2 groups were offered the opportunity to attend a weight loss group for free using vouchers which were provided by the NHS. What you can see is that both these groups lost considerably more weight. The group shown in green were given access to the weight loss group for just 12 weeks or 3 months. The group in red were able to use their vouchers over a whole year. And what you can see is that when people access these programs longer, again, they lose considerably more weight. This external support seemed to make all the difference to people in their weight loss attempt. Now, in this trial, we stopped providing the vouchers well, either at 3 months or at 12 months, and we followed people up a year later. It is true that people put some weight back on, but nonetheless, even 2 years later, people who'd been to the weight loss program were still significantly lighter than people who tried to lose weight on their own, and certainly lighter than they'd been at the start. And we know that this kind of weight reduction, even though it might seem really quite small, actually brings very big and important metabolic benefits. In particular, it can reduce the risk of diabetes. And so other studies have shown that a weight loss similar to that we saw in the group who were able to access the programme for 1 year is able to reduce the risk of developing diabetes by more than half. As a result of all that information, the National Health Service has actually set up something called the National Diabetes Prevention Programme. This is really modelled on this kind of weight loss group support to help people to lose weight in order to reduce their risk of diabetes. And this is now available across the country for people who GPs identify as being at particularly high risk of developing diabetes. This is the early data from this project. It's only been running for a couple of years now, but around 500,000 people have now been through this programme. And here you can see the data from the first few thousand, and you can see the amount of weight that they lost. The longer people stay in the programme, the more weight they lose. Unfortunately, many people do drop out of the programme over time. So you can see the number of people at each of these points diminishes, and that's really unfortunate because we know that continuing to attend a programme is associated with much better outcomes. But what we see here in this national scheme is results which are really very comparable to those we've seen in the trials. And whilst it is too early to know whether we have how many cases of diabetes have been prevented, we're very, very hopeful that that will be the case. This is the trial which illustrates why we're feeling confident. So this was a big study. It happens to have been done in the United States, but you can see the weight loss in this group shown in red was very similar to the weight loss shown in the trial I presented earlier. Again, people tended to put weight back on over time. Indeed, by about 4 or 5 years, they were pretty much the same weight as the people who hadn't lost weight in the first place. But in the bottom graph, you see the effect on their diabetes. And so that all points in time, the red line is much lower. That's because there are fewer cases of diabetes occurring. And even though this programme finished somewhere down here, even looking 10, and in fact we now have data 15 years out, we can still see that people who lost weight in the first place have significantly lower rates of diabetes later. And this tells us that even small reductions in body weight can bring big and sustained reductions in the chance of developing diabetes in the future. That's great news. But of course, if a little bit of weight loss is good, perhaps more would be better. And we've been interested in looking at more intensive programmes, particularly for people who we know are already at much higher risk. And that's particularly people who already have diabetes. And so on the back of one of the trials that we've conducted in Oxford and another trial that was done up in Newcastle and Glasgow, the NHS has now started a new programme, which you might have seen some coverage of in the media recently, sometimes called the soup and shake diet. We call it a total diet replacement programme. And what we mean by that is that people have a period of time, usually 8 to 12 weeks, where they stop eating normal food. That might sound extreme, but actually it's proved to be a very safe and effective way for people to lose weight. Although they stop going shopping and buying their usual foods, their meals are entirely replaced with specially formulated foods, which are designed to be nutritionally complete, but to have very few calories. They contain plenty of protein and fibre and all the essential vitamins and minerals people need. Now, if you stick to this, of course, you lose weight very effectively, but sticking to it's hard. And so what's really, really important is that taking these meal replacement products is also accompanied by regular behavioural support. And in the case of our trial, people had access to one-to-one support through a counsellor who was specially trained to help them firstly stick to the diet in the first place, because that's quite tough, but later to actually reduce their reliance on these meal replacements and to start consuming usual routine. So what this does is helps people to lose weight in a short, sharp intervention, but then to support them as they start to come back to usual food so that they don't gain weight again quickly. And here you see the results of our trial. So again, we recruited people who were keen to lose weight, and we randomised them into two groups. One group who had advice from a practice nurse to lose weight, and the other, shown in orange, who had this total diet replacement program. And what you can see is that the total diet replacement program was indeed very much more effective. And at the end of the program, after about 6 months, people were around 15 kilograms lighter than they were at the start. We left them to their own devices after that, and even a year later, people were still, on average, more than 10 kilograms lighter. That really is incredibly impressive weight loss and very big health benefits. Here's data from the other study that I mentioned, which was conducted in Newcastle and Glasgow. They had exactly the same intervention, but they did their study specifically for people who already had type 2 diabetes. And what you see here is that they lost a very similar amount of weight, that the amount of weight they lost was directly related to their chances of being free of their diabetes after 12 months. Let me explain that a bit more carefully. So on average, people lost around about 10 kilograms. But of course, some people lost more and some people lost less. And what we see in this chart here is that amongst those people who lost less than 5 kilograms, actually just 7% of them were free of diabetes 1 year later. But of those who lost more than 15 kilograms, actually 86% of people were free of diabetes after 1 year. And that really is, I think, a very remarkable result and has really changed the way we think about treating type 2 diabetes. In the past, we've tried to manage the condition, but now the focus is much more on treating it in order to try to help people to achieve remission from their diabetes, meaning they no longer need to take diabetes medication. And we're really delighted that this has now been adopted by government and is being rolled out nationally. Sorry, I seem to have gone slightly mad on these slides. So what I hope I've shown you in this very, very brief summary today is that firstly, we have interventions which help people to lose weight. And secondly, that they really can reduce their risk of diabetes. Now, of course, we want to measure what the effect is on all sorts of other health conditions which happen further down the line. That takes time and we have to follow people up over long periods. But in the interim, here's a really important piece of data from a group in Aberdeen. And what they did was to do what we call a systematic review of all the existing literature. So they looked across all the trials that have already been done, and they looked at what the long-term outcomes were in terms of premature death from people who'd been included and randomised into the control group, who hadn't lost very much weight, or the intervention group, the treatment group, who in general had lost more weight. And what you see here is that actually most of these studies, the people in the intervention group, actually had fewer deaths than those who were in the control. And in fact, what this showed overall is that there were 6 fewer deaths per 1,000 people if you were randomized into a weight loss treatment group. And that, I think, is, if you like, the final outcome of this, which we can reduce the risk of disease, but that also seems to reduce the risk of premature death. So there's been a bit of a race through a whole raft of our research, but I hope that what I've shown you today is that being overweight does increase the risk of ill health, including complications from COVID-19. I think that the lockdown has exacerbated the weight control challenge for many people, and lots of people are thinking about changing their lifestyle and rethinking their diet. And the new government obesity plan is really designed to make it a little bit easier for all of us to manage our weight. If you're trying to eat more healthily, the last thing you need is to see adverts for pizza and chocolate when you sit down to watch the television at the end of the day. I think what's interesting is that we've become much more accustomed to state intervention in order to protect our health. And that's perhaps allowed government to feel a little bit braver about introducing some of these new policies to prevent excess weight gain. On a really encouraging note, I think that the pandemic has accelerated the adoption of our research on effective interventions to treat obesity into NHS practice. Suddenly, government has really recognised that actually this is a way to help people improve their health. Of course, we can't be certain what the impact of losing weight will be on the severity of any future COVID cases. But what we absolutely do know is that interventions which help people to lose weight will reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes and increase life expectancy. And I think for all of the reasons that it does that, there is good reason to be optimistic that perhaps this might also be helpful in reducing the complications that we see from COVID. So thank you for your attention. I'm very happy to take some questions.
Thanks very much for that, Susan. So we've taken a few questions here. Sarah Mollart's asked if we've got any long-term data, what happens after the programs?
Great question. And if you came to a longer talk I gave, I'd tell you all about that. So I think we need to be very honest with people that after weight loss programs end, on average, people gain weight. However, there's huge variability. So in these trials, which may have hundreds or even thousands of people, we typically see that about 25% of people keep their weight off long term. The problem we have is it's really hard to identify at the beginning who is going to be in that very successful long-term weight loss maintainer. The good news, I think, is that even if you put weight back on again, there is now good evidence that you have got some health benefit. And that, I think, is something we really need to understand and to recognise. Imagine the risks of being overweight are related partly to how big you are, but also how long you've carried that excess weight. And so if you have even a period of time where lighter than you would otherwise have been, you actually reduce the metabolic damage. The final thing I'd say, I appreciate I've gone on about this a bit, but I know weight regain is an issue which really concerns people. We're just completing a big review of the literature, which has been funded by the British Heart Foundation, which looks at data from over 500 trials, and we've followed up people long term. What we see is that on average, it takes more than 5 years for people to regain the weight that they've lost. And in fact, in some trials, as long as 10 or 15 years. So I think that whilst we need to be honest and realistic that weight regain is common, and that's partly because the world we live in makes it hard to manage our weight, but weight regain is common, but some people successfully keep it off long term. People who do regain tend to regain more slowly than we sometimes imagine. And even if you regain weight, actually there's a last metabolic benefit. And so whilst it may not be the ideal solution, I think we may have to accept that in the short term, it may be necessary to actually, maybe every 5 years, you have to have a short period of trying to lose weight. And that's not ideal, but actually in managing a chronic relapsing condition, I think that may be a realistic solution. I can see other questions flooding in. To get on board with the diabetes programme. Not at the moment, and that's because you can imagine we've gone from a standing trying to offer this around the country, and so actually the number of people coming in the programme through referrals from GPs is already at the capacity that we can take, and so that's not happening at the moment. But absolutely, dentists are in a great position to really offer people evidence-based advice and support in losing weight, because actually, as you say in your comment, that can really help improve their overall health. there was a comment about the total diet replacement programs. They are going to be rolled out by the NHS. That literally just started in September. They're going to be done in a few areas around the country, and sadly Oxfordshire is not one of them. But if those trials go well, we hope that will then be made available nationally. You can do this privately, and there are a number of companies which offer that kind of support. And indeed, on our department website, there's some information for people who are interested in that approach, and Gavin can maybe put the link into the chat for that. Somebody else is asking about, is BMI the best measure of obesity? You know, it's not at all. We do quite a bit of work to understand whether specific measures of body fatness better, or maybe whether we should be looking at muscle mass, or should we be looking at where people deposit their fat. But in the end, they all give rather only very subtly different effects. So in general, for a whole population, studying BMI tells us how things are changing over time. If you're an individual, then it's sensible to have some more detailed assessment. But very few of us, except for elite athletes, are actually as muscular as we like to believe. And for most of us, excess weight is going to be excess fat. Once you've identified that you perhaps would benefit from losing, then you don't need to worry much about BMI anymore, because you can just monitor seeing what happens with your weight. Cracking through the questions, are there links from childhood obesity into adulthood? Yes, there are. In fact, this is one of the things which really concerns us about the rise in the prevalence, the number of children who are overweight, or indeed very overweight, when they're at school, because we know that that makes it much more likely that they're going to continue to be overweight as they get adulthood. However, it's not inevitable, but it is much more common. And that's really the reason why it's so important that we get children off to a healthy start with and enjoying physical activity. You know, we often tend, particularly, you know, we have our children, we think, oh, they're fine, you know, we want them to be happy. They're fine. It doesn't matter if they, you know, perhaps have a few unhealthy foods. They'll run it off, is what we tend to say to ourselves. But we need to understand that actually what we're doing is developing food preferences and eating behaviours which are going to track into our life, children off to a healthy start, and keeping some of these other foods a genuine treat rather than everyday items is really important. And of course, encouraging and supporting children to be physically active and developing those activity skills which are going to stick with them throughout their life. Okay, individual set point. So I tend to think, so there's lots of academic debate about set point. I prefer the theory of settling point. Now that might sound subtly different, but a settling point implies that there is a level of your habitual dietary intake and your habitual physical activity, which means that you settle out particular, which is really the weight that fits with your lifestyle and your eating and activity behaviours. I don't think it's set. There's no evidence that there's any particular reason why you should be at that weight, but I think it reflects our behaviours. People also think point is the idea that when you've lost weight, you're always going to come back to that point. And certainly if you look at the animal data from animal models, you do see that that does sometimes happen. What seems more likely is that there's at least a behavioural response as well as a metabolic response, but we don't fully understand what happens there. It is possible that once you've attained a higher weight, that there are some metabolic mechanisms which defend that, and that really emphasises how very important it is to try to prevent weight gain in the first place. Question here about the total diet replacement program. Yes, you mentioned this is a bit like Lighter Life and the Cambridge Diet. Yes, it is like those are these kinds of programs. If you have got medical complications, it's definitely working with your GP first. And that's particularly because if you have a condition like diabetes or high blood pressure, if you lose weight quite quickly, your medication may need adjusting. And so if you've got a medical condition, definitely worth talking to your GP before you embark on one of these programs. But the providers should encourage and support you to do that. I think that in the past, doctors have often been a little bit reluctant to encourage people to use these programs because there was very little evidence about whether they were effective or not, or whether they were safe. And I think the trials that I've talked about today have provided a lot of reassurance to health professionals that actually these are very appropriate treatments for people who are very overweight. And that's really important to emphasize. These are not treatments for people who think it would be good to lose a pound or two before they go on holiday. These are treatments for people who are carrying a lot of excess weight, whose health is being affected by that. And they really are a medical treatment for obesity. And it's important to see them in that light.
We've got time for just this last one, Susan.
Okay, last question, ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods is a phrase which is very emotional, and it kind of, people latch onto it because you can call any food that you think's a bad food, you can call it ultra-processed. It's quite a tricky definition, but in essence, if we're talking about high-fat, high-sugar foods which are sold in large portions, then yes, I think, you know, do they contribute to obesity? Probably yes, because they're very, very palatable. But you know, if I make a chocolate brownie at home, doesn't count as an ultra processed food, but nonetheless, it's got just as many calories as one which is produced by the food industry. So I think what we need to do is just to really focus in. There are some foods which are high in fat, high in sugar, that, you know, high in calories, which if we're concerned about our weight, we really need to be eating less of, putting much more emphasis on fresh, often unprocessed, basic foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, you know, minimally processed is going to make it easier to have a healthy diet. Gosh, what a fantastic set of questions. Brilliant to see people so sort of engaged and interested. And it's been a real pleasure to talk with you this evening. Thank you very much.